Hey guys, in this video I want to pick up where I left off in the last video, introducing MySQLDB in Flask, or Flask-MySQLDB to be more precise. So in the last video I showed you how to set up a simple connection to a MySQL server and then query from a table in the database that you've connected to. In this video I'm going to expand on that, and I'm going to show you how to insert records into one of your databases and query data from a table in your database. So the first thing I want to do is set up a route to allow someone to insert records into a database. So let me show you what I have right now. This is the table in my database example, the same table that I used in the previous video. So it only has one row at the moment, ID1 Hello World. And this is a really simple table, so there's no auto increment on this ID. So in this example I'm going to have to enforce the ID's uniqueness and make it a sequence. So let me show you how to do that here. So first thing I want to do is create a route that will allow the user to add something. So I'm going to call it add1, and they will supply a string, the user will supply a string, and we'll call it insert. So string insert, and then I'm going to define this add function that takes in insert. And now that I have the view set up, the first thing I want to do, or the route set up, the first thing I want to do is connect to the server and get a cursor. So just like the example from the last video here, I'm going to set cur equal to MySQL.connection, which creates the connection, and then a cursor, which returns a cursor. And then the first thing I want to do is, because there's no enforcement on this ID column, I want to make sure I'm getting whatever the highest ID in the table is. So to demonstrate that, I'll need to execute a query. So cur execute. I'm going to select the max ID from the example table. All right. And then I'm going to say max ID is equal to cur.fetch1. So I'm using fetch1 in this case instead of fetch all, because I know selecting max from a table will return just one row. So just to make it easier to handle the data, I'll only get the first result, or the first record, because there's only one record anyway. So now that I have max ID, this is a tuple, so I'll put a comment here what it looks like. So let's say the max ID is 10, then the tuple is going to look like this. So it only has one value in it, and a comma saying that it's a tuple instead of just a 10 in parentheses. So we'll have to keep that in mind when I access the 10 in this next statement. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to execute another query, but instead of a select, I want to do an insert. So insert into example, and then I need to specify the column. So ID in data. I did use data, right? Yes. Values %s %s, and I'm using %s in this case to replace these %s's with the strings in the tuple that I will define right here. So there's my query, and then the values that get replaced are going to be two things. The first is the ID. So I'm going to take the max ID, and since it's a tuple, I have to access the very first thing in the tuple. So that should be square brackets. So max ID, and then I'm going to add 1 to it to get a new ID, which is greater than the previous max. And then I'm going to add in the data. So in this case, the data is called insert, because that's what the user specified when they went to this route add1. Insert. So of course, in a real example, you would do more input validation. You wouldn't just blindly take whatever the user gave to you and put it in your database. That can be a recipe for disaster. But database security is beyond the scope of this video, so I just want to keep it simple. But just know in practice you would validate the values before inserting them into your table. So after I execute this insert statement, the last thing I need to do is commit it. So anytime you're doing a database transaction, you have the option of either committing it or rolling it back. You will want to roll it back if there was some error in between the start and finish of your inserting, so you wouldn't have corrupt data in the database. But for a simple example, that wouldn't happen since we're only inserting one thing, so we're going to commit it. The commit is on the MySQL.connection object, so MySQL.connection.commit, and this commits the value to the database. If we didn't have the commit there, then nothing would happen. The data will get inserted, and then after the cursor was closed, it will get removed because it never was committed to the database. It would roll back by default. And then finally, the last thing I want to return is done. This won't do anything else. So I have the same code in my db.py, but the only difference is it has my actual user password and db setup in it. So let me run this. So add one, and let's say we want to add test. So I call the route add one with the argument test, says done. So let's go to the database and see if we have a new row in here. And this new row should have ID of 2, and data should then be tests for that ID. So refreshing it. And yes, now we have 2 rows in this table. Let's add a couple more. Python Flask. Okay, so we should have 2 more rows. And we do Python and Flask. Alright, so now I want to create a second route that will return all the data in our table. So I'm going to call this get all. It doesn't take any arguments. First thing I need to do, just like in the add and just like on the index, I need to get the cursor. So then I'm going to execute a query. Select star from example. Simple query. And then I want to return everything into a variable. Let's call it return vals equals. And instead of fetch one, like we did in this case, we're going to do fetch all, because this is going to return more than one row. So we don't want to just get one row. We want all the rows. And now that I have return vals, they'll look something like this. So what it returns from the database is tuples. It doesn't return lists, it returns tuples. So a result set will look something like this. It has one tuple to hold all the rows, and then each individual row gets its own tuple. So let's say ID, and then it has something like ID 1, that's the string, and then another tuple, and so on. So that's what it's going to look like. So I'm going to loop over the tuple that hosts the rows for I in return vals. I want to return them to the string, so I'll create this variable, print this. It's gonna just be an empty string right now, and I'm going to concatenate the rows onto this print this. So print this, and then I. So I in this case is going to be another tuple. It's going to be one of the inner tuples, and I want to append a line break. So what I'm doing is I'm looping over every tuple in this big tuple here. I'm just going to return the tuple itself. And then once print this is built, I'll return print this. So what we should see is a tuple representation of our table in the database. So let me call the get all. And now we see we have 1 hello world, 2 test, 3 Python, and 4 Flask, which matches up perfectly with the table here in PHP-MyAdmin. And for data conversion reasons, we see the L. It's just a long integer, but this is still an integer. It's just how it's represented in Python, and the U for Unicode, but the data is the same. So one of the problems with using a method like this, connecting to MySQLDB, is it's fairly low level or relatively low level. So you have to write your own queries. You have to keep track of the data types in the database, and you have to know like the order of columns, because there's nothing telling you that this is the ID column and this is the data column. You as the programmer have to know which is which. So in the next video, I want to cover using Flask-SQL Alchemy, which is an object relational mapper, which will more closely relate the data in the database to the objects in your programming language. So there's a stronger connection between the two, and you don't have to rely on just knowing that this is the ID column, this is the data column. It's your programming language will help you along in that when you're trying to work with anything in the database. So I'll cover that in the next video, but thanks for watching this one. I'll include the code in the description below on GitHub, so you can just go there to get this code. So, thanks for watching.